ready? You got me running.
I am Meredith Hirsh, and this is Working Healthcare. I just interviewed Paul Harris. What a fun conversation. He actually turned the tables a little bit and interviewed me. He was certainly a dynamic guest. He started out as a journalist, so probably why he asks such great questions, and he segued his way into healthcare. He works on the scheduling side. And just to let you know, not scheduling patient appointments costs the healthcare system over $100 billion a year. We talked about how he got into healthcare. We talk about the problems he saw when he entered healthcare, working in it, not as a patient. And then we talk about what he's doing to fix the healthcare system in America. We finish it up with why AI is a must if you work in healthcare. You won't want to miss it. Paul Harris, welcome to Working Healthcare.
Hi, Meredith. How are you?
I'm excited to have this conversation because we're really going to talk about operational workflow. Patients are routinely falling out of care. The system then builds these businesses to bring them back into practices. And my real question today that I want to cover is, are we improving care or are we recovering lost revenue? So here's some shocking statistic. Between the revenue lost to a medical practice and health deterioration, missed appointments cost about $150 billion annually in the United States. And you probably already know that statistic. I had to do a little bit of research. But when a patient disappears, is that the patient's fault or is that how the system was set up?
Great question, right? And so another statistic I think is very interesting is that I work a lot with private practices, and what we typically find and has been my experience is that if you look into their practice management database, about 25% of them will be completely lost, right? Mm-hmm. No future appointment, no recall, but they're out there diagnosed with some sort of need, care, disease, what have you. And again, okay, so you ask, is that the patient's fault or is it the system's fault? And like many things in life, ultimately it is a mix of both, right? And I think it's part of the patient's responsibility to talk to their provider and understand their care cycle. But, when you're talking about something more routine, right? I live in the world of eye care, right? It's easy to miss your general eye appointment. Right. And then let something progress. And then 6 more months pass by. And then a year passes by. Right. And then all of a sudden you're far gone off the schedule, but maybe you're also developing other conditions. This happens to patients all the time. So to the system, it's like your practice also has to hold the responsibility that if it's something more serious, like you have a serious glaucoma or retinal condition, or you have an unremoved cataract and you're slowly going blind, like it's your responsibility to make sure that you have a process that continues to follow up and does your best due diligence to get them back on that schedule for care.
But a lot of practices don't do that. Now, I require my doctors to ask for PTO 90 days ahead of time. I have a friend who's a radiologist, and he's actually a partner in that radiology practice, and he is required to give PTO requests a year in advance. But I'm telling you, when I go to my pediatrician, they don't even open up the books to schedule a follow-up appointment for my kid for 60 days max, and that's max. Usually they'll say, you know what, give us a call for the annual appointment, or if you need a follow-up, let's say in 3 months, they're like, give us a call in a month. And now you're putting the burden on the patient, and our average patient is 76 years old. I promise you, we would have a huge fall-off rate if we didn't schedule an appointment.
Yeah, in that case, it's the practice's fault, right? The most effective practices do not let any patients leave without a future appointment on the books. And a lot of people worry about, maybe they don't need to because maybe this appointment can go out 12 or 18 months. And, you're putting that, as you said, the onus on the patient to remember to call back in. It's like, why does a practice necessarily care if an appointment has to be out, let's say, 12 plus months. And then, let's say that there is a PTO schedule or some kind of scheduling mishap. Most people are reasonable, right? As long as you have a process to say, listen, we had this time on the slot. It's no longer available for whatever reason. Could we reschedule? Ultimately, I just want a world where everybody has an upcoming appointment for the care that they need. Right.
I will schedule, well, in our practice, I will schedule patients at checkout. I require my entire staff to schedule a patient at checkout. I don't care if it's in 2 years, you're scheduling the patient. I don't want a PRN. I want you will schedule, because even if you have an acute condition, that condition could come back. And I'm okay if you cancel your appointment with advance notice, but I want to make sure that we are doing our part as a medical practice to schedule you and follow up. Now, I get a mammogram every year. I've gotten a mammogram every year since I was 35 years old, and it is covered by my insurance. I don't need a referral. But do you know, when I leave the appointment for my last mammogram, they will not schedule my mammogram for a year from now.
Yeah. And what happens?
Yeah.
What happens in a year to you?
Exactly. I actually forgot an appointment maybe about 9 years ago, and I swear I would have never forgotten that appointment. I am the most OCD person I know, and my mom just died of metastatic breast cancer, and she was first diagnosed when I was 34 years old. Hence, I've been getting mammograms, breast MRIs on a continuous basis. My life got so crazy when I was about 42 years old. I went back to grad school, and I had 3 kids, and I was running the Hirsh Center, and I completely forgot. And the hospital called me 6 months after that 1 year lapse. So 18 months later, and they're like, you need to schedule your mammogram. And I'm like, I swear I just had it 6 months ago. And I was so busy, I forgot. But I think if that happens to me at 42, as OCD as I am, that has to happen to the majority of patients.
Yes. And you're not alone. We're all lost patients at some level. And I mean, I can pick on my own self. My simple dental appointment is an example in my younger 20s, right? Was I going every single 6 months to get a regular cleaning? No. But as I get older, I'm like, yeah, I need my teeth cleaned. And, and of course, something like a mammogram is significantly more serious. Colonoscopies are an example of this, retinal care, skin checks for dermatology. In every single specialty, you think about these kind of appointments that are the bread and butter appointments, right? Those general exam type appointments that you need to go to before something progresses into something serious. And people put it off. And most practices do not have an internal system or process to reach out to patients who become overdue. And ultimately, Meredith, right? I live in the overdue world, right? Hey, listen, man, you are completely past your due date of care. Like you're 2, 3 years overdue. In an ideal world, my company doesn't exist, right? We want to catch people long before they become significantly overdue. It's really like that 6 months past, which is that critical area where most people just need a reminder. Hey, listen, you need to schedule your upcoming appointment for XYZ.
So why won't patients do it? Why won't medical practices do it? Why doesn't my pediatrician office allow me to schedule my kids' appointments for even the next year?
Well, I don't necessarily have an answer for that. I think a lot of it's fear-based about, well, what if? Are we still going to have that provider? We don't open our schedules that far. Every practice is different, right? But what most practices do at a bare minimum, right? In our world, we like to call these the 3 R's. You have your appointment reminder, your appointment recall, and then I live in this kind of reactivation space, right? So the reminder, everyone's aware of that. Text, hey, Meredith, you got an upcoming appointment, confirm it, yes or no, right? We all seen that. And then most practice management systems also have that recall process. So show or you miss. And then this recall process is either done with a system, or as we know, most practices just have somebody in the front staff or whoever in the call center making that one attempt, right? A recall. Hey, we wanted you in for whatever reason, we missed you. Please make that attempt, right? And that's usually a 1, 2, maybe at max 3 times attempt. But there is still so much opportunity for those patients who are inevitably going to ignore that recall and then become significantly overdue.
You and I met because of Tara Gillespie, who is
Yeah.
the CEO of a large dermatology practice in Kansas. And
Yeah.
I love Tara, and that's how you became a listener to Working Healthcare.
Yeah.
But what I loved about your background is you're a journalist. How in the heck did you get into healthcare?
I tripped into it like most of us do, Meredith. Like, yeah, I know that your background's in writing, and I was primarily in the broadcast side. I came out of college thinking that I was going to be this big reporter and be this cool investigative journalist. So, came out of college, moved immediately to Washington D.C., right, and lived there for what ended up being a very tough year of my life, really humbling year of my life. And doing broadcast journalism for a small news outlet. And, subsequently realizing that that was a life that was hard and always a grind, as any job is. But I realized I could kind of segue my experience of creating good content into the marketing realm. So I found myself back in New England, where I'm based, linked up with a company that did marketing, great websites, great digital design, and they happened to be in the eye care vertical, ophthalmology. So I got this completely unexpected education in this medical vertical, and through that we expanded into other verticals. And I began to love the world, and kind of specifically the world of a practice admin. Right, I have a lot of respect for these people. They work so hard and they are so passionate to provide the best care they can to the patients, and they're dealing with all this stuff with their staff and difficult providers and everything, their whole world. And I just became obsessed of, like, how do you make an admin's life a little less chaotic? And that's sort of been where I've been throughout my career.
What surprised you most when you got into the healthcare sector, when you stepped foot into the private practice realm?
I guess as a young man, I was a little cynical about healthcare, right? Hey, they're just in it to make money, right? And particularly with a lot of practices, just kind of, I always felt like they were trying to upsell services or aesthetics or cosmetics and whatever it may be, and then always into it kind of just to continue to on this cycle of care. What I've come to learn is that these providers and admins and people within practices, they really genuinely care about you. And they're doing a really tough job, and they're dealing with a lot of people that, let's be frank, don't treat them well. A lot of patients that are mean to them. And I've grown to have a lot of empathy, particularly for private practices, because it's the difficult thing to do, right? I mean, you can go to private equity realms, you can go to major hospital systems, but to do it independently, privately, and to do it at the top, the best ability, it's something I've really grown to respect.
I love what you said, because people do not go into healthcare if they are not caring individuals. You can make money in a lot of other sectors. Go sell used cars. But if you want to care for people, that's when healthcare is a calling and it's not just a job. So I agree with you. We're not here to like one up and one sell somebody else into something. When did you realize, though, the system wasn't really working the way that you thought it was supposed to work? Just from a person that wasn't infused in the healthcare world prior, and now that you are, when did you realize that the system doesn't really work the way that you thought it should work?
I don't want to beat up on the entire system. I think there are areas of healthcare which are extremely impressive, and always on like the leading edge of technology. What in my world specifically, when it comes to what I'm doing with practice every day, and identifying patients that are becoming significantly overdue for care, and subsequently like developing really, really serious diseases, and unfortunately, some of these patients just don't make it. I think what I realized didn't work was when I connect into these databases and I really show them, we call it their opportunity for reactivation, but sometimes it's like, it's an opportunity for them to bring back a certain percentage, but it also shows you the leakage that's happening across the entire healthcare system. And, leakage is opportunity financially back to the practice, but it's also like, leaves behind all these patients with critical conditions, right? And I guess the other area too is that some of these patients leak because of our broken healthcare insurance system, right? And that's another area where it's just like, wow, you do have certain patients that would come back, but for whatever reason they can't afford to, and that is the saddest thing.
Well, 15 to 30% of appointments are actually missed, and
Yeah,
more than 50% of patients miss care annually. In fact, if you break it down even more, 15% is in the primary care world. If you look at outpatient specialty care like us, we're in the rheumatology world, you're looking at like 15 to 25%. But then when you get into where you have your sweet spot, ophthalmology
yeah.
and dermatology, and even behavioral health, that is up to almost 30%. It can't all be because of insurance concerns.
No.
What do you think the reason is for this fall off?
Lack of systems, lack of good systems that are automated. I think that is a huge error. I mean, like all of the answers to your question you've asked me, Meredith, like the overall answer is that it depends, right? Every single patient is specific. It could be that the patient is lazy and so on and so forth, or insurance issues. But I would say that it really comes down to a lack of a system that's effective. If you're going to rely not on some automation and somebody within your staff to be responsible for calling all the no-shows and calling all the cancellations and sending out recalls, that is an unrealistic expectation, depending on the frame of your practice. If you get over 2, 3, 4 providers in your practice, you've got patients, you're a very, very busy group, and you cannot rely on your team to do this in a way that is going to allow no leakage without using a system.
Do practices even know how many patients they're losing?
Oftentimes, no, no. I just connected yesterday with a dermatology practice, 44-ish providers in Seattle, and I like to play a little Price is Right with them, right? So I'll say, okay, guess how many patients we've found in your database, right? You can't go over, and they significantly underguessed it by about 50%, right? And another thing that we also look at is provider busyness, right? So I want to grade every provider and their specialty based on how busy they are nationally, right? And what I find is that oftentimes practices misinterpret who their busiest doctors are, and which providers have more availability, right? So it's not
Explain that.
only
Explain that a little bit more, because that's a little shocking, that statement to me. I feel like I know who my busiest doctors are, but what do you
yeah.
mean that practices misinterpret who their busiest doctors are?
Well, I always say that sometimes busyness is more of a mentality than a reality. And busyness looks different for every single practice, right? So your founding providers, the ones that own the practice, they're busy. We get it. They're busy. They got a full schedule. They're booked out weeks. But often also they could be busy with the wrong appointment types, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I look at things like, you want to keep every single top provider practicing at the highest level of their medical license. So I look at these lost appointments and say, yeah, like, hey, I'll use eye care for an example, right? Your top ophthalmologist, your number one MD in a practice, they're going to have a ton of overdue eye exams. Why? Because they're focusing on the cataract exams and the more, complicated surgical cases. So what we do is we look at that and say, well, maybe your lower level, OD partners on the practice have a little bit more availability. And I oftentimes, when I talk to an admin and they say, oh, we're a really busy practice, they're thinking about it from the mind frame of their top leadership, right? Their top MDs, their founding partners, and of course they're busy. But I find that most practices always have more availability in the schedule than they ever kind of really understand.
I like what you said about making sure that everybody practices at their highest degree and highest level. And I use that for an example in our practice, because my husband and I were the founders of the practice, and he is very busy, and he has created a finite type of patient that he sees. He spends all of his time focused on musculoskeletal ultrasound and providing care for patients with joint pain issues, and he focuses on those with inflammatory arthritis. But we have a lot of patients or people who will call our practice and want to see him for osteoporosis, and he doesn't. And they'll say, no, 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 I'll wait, or I'll go somewhere else. And they don't go anywhere else. And so 2, 3, 4 years down the road, they'll finally call our practice after they've had a fracture or their primary care doctor has been insistent that you have to see somebody. And at that point, it's delayed care for the patient. And I have the hardest time having that conversation with patients to direct them to somebody else in our practice, like maybe one of our PAs or nurse practitioners who can 100% take care of their osteoporosis needs. So how do practices communicate that to patients?
Yeah, it's common. And the answer is it's difficult, right? It sounds like your husband's a great provider and people want to see great providers, but great providers want to see complicated cases, right? And so I guess my short answer is that you have to educate that, maybe what you're looking at right now is preventative care that we can handle with another person. And ultimately, my message to me is like, if you get to the level where you're seeing my husband, something's gone wrong. You know what I mean? Like you shouldn't be there. You could have prevented this with someone else in our practice. And I ask you too, Meredith, what do you think will happen to your patients the day that he retires or leaves?
Oh, I know. I think about that all of the time because we have grown at such a rate, and he really wants to work with the other providers who have joined us, the new rheumatologists, even our mid-levels, and be able to teach them what he knows. But he was up until 11:30 last night working on notes and following up on complex cases. Enough is enough. The man's 56 years old, and some people listening to this podcast might say, oh, that's really young. But you know what? We're working 7 days a week. Enough is enough. Like, we want to be able to empower other people, to be able to teach those who are coming into physician care and medical care so that they can take care of patients as well. So succession planning is so important, and I'm really glad you bring that up because you're right. What happens when he goes on vacation? You're really going to wait for him to be able to see you? We handpicked these providers to be able to take care of patients, but I think that patients think that that's a sales pitch.
Yeah. And it is, succession planning is also so important for what in my work of lost patients. Like oftentimes I find that one of the two easiest ways that we'll see significant patients leak through the gaps are when a provider leaves or retires, right? Which happens every single day. Patients oftentimes don't identify themselves with the branding of the practice. Right? They're not saying, I get my care done at, Alabama's dermatology, whatever, right? No, they don't think that way. I go to Dr. Smith, right? And then when Dr. Smith is gone, they feel like, well, I don't have a doctorate, right? And then they become completely lost or overdue. And oftentimes they don't understand that they could just be reassigned within the practice to another provider, but they'll go to, a competitor, or worse, just stop getting treatment or care completely. And the other area where practices lose a ton of information is whenever they switch their practice management system. That is also a critical, a lot of practices are either running still on paper, or maybe they're kind of in an antiquated system that was, early 90s, and they've been running around with it for a long time. So when you do finally upgrade, we find oftentimes that patients aren't properly transferred in a way that makes them eligible for kind of reactivation to the practice. Like their billing codes do not follow, and there's certain demographic and field information that doesn't get transferred. And that's a huge area where patients are just fall through the cracks.
And missing one appointment significantly reduces the likelihood of a patient returning. So could you describe the difference again between what recall is and reactivation, since we're talking about patient drop-off?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when I'm talking about when When I'm talking about reactivation, what I've typically thought about is that you're looking at any patient overdue over the past 5 years, right? I look 5 years back in this case, let's say like even from like the pandemic, COVID forward, and say, okay, who are these patient bases that over the years have completely fell off? But most practices, like I said, do use a recall attempt. So it's usually a single attempt that's typically included in many practice management systems to say, hey, Meredith, we missed you, or you no-showed or canceled an appointment. Would you please call? Again, putting the onus on you to get back onto the schedule. And then many practices will say, okay, we're going to allow Meredith the goodwill to come back on her own within maybe a 30, 45-day time frame. And that can be completely adjusted for many practices. Some practices want to be really aggressive and say, like, we're going to give them 2 weeks to respond to this particular attempt. And then at some point, they're defined as completely overdue for care.
If recall worked, would reactivation exist?
You'd hope so. I mean, in an ideal world, maybe reactivation wouldn't exist. I think that regardless of whatever happens at a practice, patients will fall through the care gaps.
So do you think at Brexium, you're solving a problem or you're compensating for a breakdown in the system?
That is an excellent question.
That's what I work on. Excellent questions.
Yeah, excellent. I would, my heart wants to answer that we've created a solution for a huge break in the system, and there are two opportunities, right? You have to look at it from the patient care standpoint and of course a revenue standpoint. I deal with private practices. At the end of the day, they got to keep the lights on. And I said, as I said, what I typically find is 25% is overdue for most practices. And what we typically find is that 25% can be worth millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
But also within that millions of dollars are people who are like critically ill or critically in pain or what have you, and they need to come back. It's not about every patient should be back. It's about like who's the right patient to the right provider at the right time. You know what I mean? And what's going to drive value, not only just from an ROI standpoint, but from like this patient absolutely fell off the schedule for whatever reason, and they should. Not only it would be good to have them on the schedule, they should be on the schedule.
If behavior is predictable, though, why aren't we creating systems around that behavior? My EHR, oh my God, I feel like it's pulling teeth to be able to set up these recall systems and then even a reactivation system. I'd be lucky to be able to get to that. At this point, we independently created various reports. We call them send out reports. So patients who were sent out for imaging or were sent to a referral for a specific issue and didn't return, we go ahead and we call them. If I start texting our patients, they call back and they're like, take me off the text. This is awful. Why do you keep harassing me?
Right.
So I'm in a tough situation trying to explain this to my staff as to why it is our responsibility at this point to recall or reactivate this patient. So going back, how can we create systems for this predictable behavior? Because it seems to be pretty predictable.
Yeah. How much time? Well, before I dive into that, how much time do you and your team, you would estimate, maybe even just like a week, spend on doing that?
Oh God, I can't even tell you. And we're still not doing a great job because they'll say, well, we call at 9 a.m. and the patient tells us we woke them up, or we had to leave a voicemail message. We leave a voicemail message probably 80% of the time. And I call it patient touch points, right? We need to create patient touch points. I was an advertising major in the College of Journalism, and back then it was the rule of 3. You needed to send a message in various ways at least 3 times for it to be retained. Now, because we're muddled with all of this extraneous information, it's become the rule of 7. And so I tell my staff this and I try to share, but they are afraid of the one criticism or two criticisms from the patient saying, why are you calling me? I'll call you when I need you. So again, it goes back to really where I started. Is it a patient's responsibility? Hey, it's your healthcare, or is it the practice's responsibility?
Yeah. Well, in your particular case, this is why you have to lean on the new tools of automation. Like that's just simply a waste of like, your time, right? For you guys to be calling. And I get it why they don't want to call. First of all, it sounds like it sucks. Like, and nobody likes to get treated badly by a patient, right? And it's not a good use of time. So, that's kind of where systems like this have to come into this space and say, okay, like we're going to do all this automation to make sure all these, and again, you said it, the diversification of messages is important. You don't want to just text someone, hey, Meredith, hey, Meredith, hey, Meredith, come back, over and over and over again. That's annoying, right? So what yields higher conversion rates for them to actually respond and come back is start with maybe an email, then follow up with a text message, then follow up with an automated call. At every level, give them options to opt out of communication, right? You don't want if they make their own personal health decisions as they're empowered to, they should have the power to opt out, and at least you've informed them that they're overdue for care. And even on our system, you can send a postcard. And if you're dealing with a lot of elderly patients, it's like to this day in 2026, sending a patient a postcard that looks like it comes from your provider saying, hey, you're overdue. We need to call back on the schedule. They put it on the fridge. It's still to this day one of our highest conversion rates to get people back.
Of course it is. Listen, our average patient is 76 years old. Of course they love the postcard.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how we can fix this at the very beginning. When a patient enters a practice, what typically happens after the first visit? And is there something that we can do better to ensure that we don't have to reactivate the patient down the road?
Yeah. Well, I think the number one thing that should happen is that patient should leave with a future appointment. That's the number one thing. It has to be embedded into your workflow. They stop by the desk, or they're getting checked out, or even while they're still in the room, hey, Meredith, just looking out next 6 months, does October, whatever, work for you? Yes, it does. Great. Then we're going to have a system, because we know people are forgetful. You can't be writing it on a little business card anymore. You have to have, a reminder that comes via text and emails, and make sure that's a strong system, right? That's the first line of defense, is that everybody that should leave with an appointment leaves with an appointment. And then your second line of defense is, okay, what is our immediate backup plan for these no-shows and cancellations that happen daily, right? And there are good ways and multiple ways that practices can prefer to do it. If a practice prefers to hire somebody on staff and be responsible for that and own that role, fine. That's good. If a practice wants to automate that through a system, whether it be something like ours or any other systems that's in the market, great. That's good. And then the third line of defense is, what happens if the 1, 2, 3 attempts do not work? Now you've got a high value patient out there that, and we see this in derm too, right? Now they're sending like certified letters. They're trying to figure out like, okay, this patient potentially has skin cancer. What do we do? Like, it's a huge liability. They have to make sure they inform him. That's where you should really think about, we need to automate this. Right. We're already doing the best we can to make sure this patient's staying on the schedule, but we need a safety net, essentially, to make sure that, okay, we know people are still going to fall through. At least we're doing our due diligence to contact the ones that we would want back in the practice.
In that entire system that you outlined, where do patients drop off most often?
Where?
At what point in the process do patients drop off? Is it after the first appointment? Is it after you've scheduled the appointment? Is it then when the patient calls because you scheduled it out 6 months and now the patient is sick, or the patient is going on vacation and had to cancel and then doesn't reschedule? Is it that the practice isn't rescheduling the patient? When does the break happen most often?
Most often I see that people just ignore their recalls. So yeah, but again, we do see a mix of it. You're just going to have these non-compliant patients that don't book, and then I would say that the majority of the practices that I do speak with, they understand the concept of leaving with an appointment. But I find that that's a lot more common with private practices. They get that concept for some reason, like the bigger hospital systems, like I was saying, like your pediatrics example earlier in the conversation, like that is bizarre to me, right? They will kind of be more lenient and allow patients to just walk out because maybe they don't need to be seen in 18 months. So they just put the onus on you to make sure that you are making sure your children get the care they need.
I'm grateful that my kids played sports because that was the reason why I would remember
Yeah.
to schedule
Yeah.
their annual appointment. It's
Yeah.
crazy in pediatrics
Yeah.
that they're doing this. And most
Yeah.
pediatric practices at this point are not independent, right? They
Yeah.
are probably taken over by private equity or in some conglomerate. But
Yeah.
each missed appointment average is about $200. It's worth about $200.
Oh.
So the practice loses significant annual revenue. Do you think reactivation reduces the cost to a practice or it helps recover revenue? I'm pivoting to the business side of this.
Yes. I would say that I always think about it from a revenue recovery standpoint. Yeah. That there are some patients out there that are just low hanging fruit that will return back into revenue. And then, because where are the two ways that practices get patients from, right, Meredith? You have your net new, and that's where I started in my career. Marketing, right? Like, let's get a new patient in, let's work on our referrals, and then have a great website and do Google ads and whatever we can to get net new patients in the door. That's really expensive. And it's really hard. And it's still to this day really hard to measure the success of it. So reactivation for me, it's like, why don't you swim in your own pond? You have this natural leakage that's just naturally going to happen. And it's no fault of the practices, really. It's constantly happening. It's happening daily. Patients are becoming overdue for care, but they will come back. You know what I mean? Of that 25% of your database that's gone, you could easily, over time, recover 15% of it. And these are not little percentages. This is like, for most practices, it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars. So it's just swim, like fish in your own pond and just get these patients back.
I'm so glad you said that because I run those statistics every year with a goal of number of times a unique patient comes into the practice. And our goal is 4. And that is because of the world in which we work in rheumatology. So our patients typically have some type of autoimmune condition, an inflammatory arthritis, or if they have joint pain, and we're dealing with patients, our average patient age is 76, patients may have shoulder pain, or they may have knee pain, or they may have hip pain, and we're only able to treat 1 or 2 areas per visit, or they have osteoporosis, and we need to be able to provide the continuity of care over time. So 4 is our magic number. And the years that we do well are the years that we focus on our existing patient base. Because you are right, we grow by about 200 to 300 new patients a month. There is no reason why we should not be bursting at the seams every single day because of existing patient volume.
Yeah.
And so that's what's really important for practices to hear. Now, you and I speaking about this, we live in the business side of medicine, and that's what working healthcare is all about. People who are listening are like, well, don't they care about the patient? This is all about the patient. But the truth is, this is about patient care, and it's also to make sure that we as practices are sustainable. So going back, are we improving outcomes for patients, or are we just focused on filling schedules?
Oh, you're improving outcomes for sure, and I think everything goes hand in hand. Like, as I said about my revelation about most of these practices I work with. They care about their patients, but at the end of the day, too, the schedule, a booked schedule, is secured income, right? And that's the bottom line, right? Nobody likes gaps in their schedule, particularly when you're paying a high valued surgeon a very, very good salary. You don't want that person sitting around in the break room drinking coffee, right? We want to make sure that they've got a booked schedule. And as you said, there's really no reason, unless you're a brand new practice that opened yesterday, that, if you have a couple years of legacy history of patients, there are plenty of patients out there that need care, that should be on your schedule, whether they're coming in net new or they're being reactivated. They're right there, and it's just the onus is on the practice to develop a system to make sure that they're keeping their schedules full.
I always say that when you help doctors practice medicine, you're helping patients. And when you help patients, you're helping doctors, which is the opposite. If you're helping insurance companies, you aren't helping doctors or patients. But to me, the relationship with the patient and the doctor, it goes hand in hand.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about private equity, because you work in the ophthalmology world, you work in the dermatology world, you have seen a huge influx of PE in this world. What changes when PE enters the picture?
Everything. You're right. PE over I've been in this medical world for just about 10 years now, and I've seen private equity in the eye care world just completely take over and continue to take over. I think what ultimately changes at the end of the day, and I think this is no surprise to anyone, is that private equity is really about the business side and about improving, revenue to their companies, right? And I think by doing that, you do a couple things that we've noticed. I mean, you tend to take physicians in and really, really overburden them. And ultimately, that leads to what I would basically call a decreased, outcome for patient care. And that's of course my perspective. I know that private equities work really closely on this, and I know that they do care about their patients. But I think when you solely are focusing on the ones and zeros in the Excel spreadsheet, ultimately, there is an overall trickle upon your staff, your doctors, and in the patients.
And Brevium, the company that you work for, actually doesn't even work in the rheumatology world yet. Are you seeing more focus on retention? And I say that because you focus on dermatology and ophthalmology. Are we seeing more focus on retention with these PE-backed practices as a revenue strategy more than as a patient outcome strategy?
It's both, right? I mean, if they're going to own the practices, and we have to remain a viable business, there's part of us having to play their game, right? And again, I don't want to lead that PE's evil, but I think that ultimately you have to think about outcomes. And you have to think about, what do these PEs care about? So I guess it's about it's the shift in the way you present the ultimate data, right? When you're talking to a private equity, like a group, you're really talking about how much revenue am I able to drive? And if you're talking to a private practice, you're really talking about, okay, like, what are the qualities of the patients that I brought back? What providers benefited the most? What diseases did they have? And ultimately, what is that doing for my bottom line?
What do you think happens to patient, or not patient morale, but physician morale when PE comes in?
I think that they become a little bit less happy, to be completely honest. Yeah. I think it's very common, and that also depends on their subspecialty. I think retina in my world is a really good example. I just came from a retina show, and in the subspecialty of retina, their appointment times are variable. Like, you could have a retina appointment that takes 15 minutes, and then you could have a serious case that takes an hour and a half long. It's very hard to determine kind of a solidified schedule in that world. And that doesn't necessarily fit the perfect private equity model, right? Where they want predictability so they can know, okay, like how many patients is this provider seeing today and what is the ROI on that?
Who owns the patient relationship in a hospital, in a medical practice, within our American healthcare system?
I almost want to put that back on you. To me, it's the provider, right? At the end of the day, like I'm not a provider. You know, I'm not a physician. I think at the end of the day, that patient's care has to be determined with the provider, and you have to have trust in the providers that you're seeing. They're determining what the care cycle should be. So yeah, to me, this is a one-on-one relationship with you and your doctor.
And since you said you wanted to throw it back on me, I would say it's the practice. I would say if you are in solo practice, it is the provider. If you are in a group, there's a lot of cross coverage that's involved. And again, if you can't get in with Dr. Hirsh, we have an amazing team who can take care of that patient. And we all take responsibility as a practice for that patient. So yes, I agree to a point with you, but I would also grab that on more as the practice responsibility, which then goes into a whole nother sector. If we talk about PE, then that PE entity would be responsible for the patient. I also think that it's very important for the patient to have autonomy and to be responsible for his or her health journey.
Yeah, 100%.
It's a relationship.
It's hard to argue your point. You know, the holistically, the practice is of course, they're embedded one-on-one in that relationship with the patient. But yeah, I think what happens, in a room between you and the provider, ultimately, I think is really the relationship that should be solidified with the patient. That's what's going to develop the most trust and make sure that patient's getting taken care of appropriately.
Paul, if you could create one change within our American healthcare system the years that you've been involved in this, what change would you create?
The answer to this is going to be a little bit above my pay grade, but I think I think I have to start with some kind of reform of how we're embedded with insurance companies in America. I think a lot of issues overarching between practices and patient care and ultimate outcomes boil down to how insurance companies operate in our country, and ultimately don't seem like they have the best, the patients really in mind.
Paul Harris, thank you for joining me on Working Healthcare. If this conversation hit home or made you think a little differently, don't keep it to yourself. Share the episode, tag a friend, or post about it on social media. Connect with me on LinkedIn to keep the conversation going in between episodes. If you've got a question, an episode idea, or someone you think I should feature, send me a note at meredithhirsh.com. Thank you all for the 5-star reviews. They help more listeners find the show. New episodes drop every Tuesday. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Tune in weekly as we explore the inner workings of healthcare, because you can't fix what you don't understand.